Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Gillian Hepburn, and I'm from Schroders. Welcome to the fourth podcast from the Diversity Project Gender Workstream, where we explore a range of themes and consider how to encourage women in particular to join our industry. However, everybody's welcome to listening to these podcasts. Now, last month, we looked at celebrating our differences and considered how to be yourself at work. What does this actually mean? Is there a stereotypical female within financial services and asset management? And if so, is it okay to be different? And this and other podcasts are already available to listen to on the Diversity Project website, but also on Spotify. I think that's quite cool, actually. This month, we're going to continue on the theme of being different and specifically focus on emotions. Interesting topic. So if women are more emotional than men, are we able to display that at work, or is it a sign of weakness? So some interesting questions here. Equally, where does emotional intelligence fit into this overall conversation? So first up, who's in the virtual studio with me today? Well, first of all, I'd love to introduce Upi to us. She's from the Career Collective and has 15 years experience in advising organisations on diversifying talent pools and creating more inclusive workplaces. She's been involved in a range of diversity and inclusion initiatives sponsored by people like Google, the Government Equalities Office, and Facebook. Fascinating. I think that's a whole other podcast in its own right. And she works with businesses around the globe on their D&I agendas to positively impact workplace dynamics. She's got a BA in politics, an MA in international security and terrorism, which again, I think is a whole other podcast, and has recently completed an executive programme in gender balance at INSEAD Business School. So welcome. Bukola is also joining us today, and she's a graduate from City University of London, where she studied economics. Interestingly, she also spent some time abroad in South Korea, where she's got some fascinating stories about gender issues there. Again, another podcast, yeah? However, she also has two brothers, so she knows all too well about having to be a strong woman. It's not just in the workplace, is it? And she also did an internship at a predominantly male firm where she felt she couldn't completely be herself and express her emotions. So that's my guests for today. And I'm going to start by exploring what we mean by emotional intelligence and how it relates to being emotional. As per previous podcasts, I always start by turning to the dictionary. Well, online these days. Emotional intelligence, or emotional quotient, where the EQ comes from, is the capability to recognise our own emotions and those of others. It can guide our thinking and behaviours, and often we want to adjust our emotions to different situations, but indeed it can also drive positive leadership and performance. It's also often associated with empathy. So with all of that in mind, Upi, I'm going to start off with you. What's your thoughts on all of this?
Thank you for having me, first of all. Lovely to be here. So I see emotional intelligence as not only how we handle ourselves, but also our relationships, how we navigate our own positive and negative emotions, but also how we respond to the emotions of those around us. So similar to what you've just shared. The term is actually popularized by a psychologist called Daniel Goleman, and I really like the way he kind of breaks it down. And he says that every emotion has a function, and he frames emotional intelligence in 4 domains. They are self-awareness. So knowing what we're feeling and why we're feeling it is the foundation of our intuition and our decision-making. And then self-management. So when it comes to negative or distressing emotions, how we handle these in an effective way, so it doesn't really derail what's happening in that moment, but also attuning to that and learning from, what we've learned in that process of how we've handled those negative or distressing emotions. And then when it comes to positive emotions, recognizing where these are happening for us, we can replicate that, those happy feelings, we get enthused, and then we're able to align our actions with our passions and kind of get that buzz again. Then the third is empathy, which is obviously what you shared, and it's knowing what someone else is feeling. And I think that's really key and underpins emotional intelligence. And then the last is social skill. And that's kind of putting all of the above together and forming kind of how our interactions based on regulating our emotions and how we respond to those around us and their behavior and their emotion and their language style.
I actually think you've made a really interesting point there up front when you talked about negative and positive, because often when we think about emotions, right, we think about negative emotions, don't we? We think about people being emotional in a negative sense. So I think that's a really interesting point that you made there. So what you're saying is actually it's about keeping them in balance a bit, isn't it?
Keeping them in balance, realizing where we're seeing, how we're triggered, what we're triggered, you know, maybe even like writing down a journey. Like, I think data is everything. I think our data, and I'm going to speak about that a little bit later on in the session. But, understanding how we're affected in a situation, just noting that down is really, really important for us to kind of take ourselves to that next level. But also understanding that, you know, when we see, it's also about reframing, right? Reframing that you're emotional as a superpower, essentially.
And I love that phrase. We'll probably come back to that. But Bukola, what are your thoughts on this? Let's bring you into the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Just to echo what Uppy has been saying, I believe that emotional intelligence is the ability to identify your emotions, and not just your own, but the emotions of others, and also learn how to manage them in a way that doesn't jeopardize the life that you've built for yourself. But there was something that Uppy was talking about in terms of positive and negative emotions that I do want to chime into. And I believe that emotions aren't positive nor negative, they just are. And what makes them positive or negative is how we react to them, our actions when they come up. So I think that this view that emotions is negative or positive has to do with how the emotion comes out in people.
That's a really good point. It's about kind of how we express it, and also maybe how other people perceive it. Yeah, what does it feel like to them? Let's move on to thinking about that then in terms of demonstrating our emotions, because it's often said, isn't it, that women are a bit more emotional than men, and I've had numerous debates with many of the people that I work with about it, because I know that at times I can get a bit emotional, and sometimes it's just because I care passionately, or I'm expressing frustration. But are we generally more emotional than men, or are we just actually, do they just hide it better than we do? Do we just wear our hearts on our sleeves? And actually maybe men are conditioned to behave differently from an early age. Upi, what do you think about that one?
So I completely agree with everything you've just said. And the research has shown us that women tend to be better than men on average at empathy. And particularly emotional empathy. So that's maybe why that spills out. And sensing in the moment, you know, how the other person is feeling, and also at social skills and keeping things feeling good between people in a group. And men, on the other hand, you know, are better on average at self-confidence, and particularly in groups, and at managing distressing emotions, according to the research, more effectively than women do. So I guess that's why we see it in that way, but it's exactly what Bukola was saying. It's about how we then respond to those situations, how we then interact with that. And that is, you know, where we get these kind of, I guess, patterns that have developed, all these social conditioning, etc. So it's really important to think about how we express ourselves and look at behavioral traits, rather than a clear delineation between genders or simplified stereotypes, essentially. You know, the alpha male that is tough and strong and shows no emotion, or the fragile female that cries if you say boo, or needs saving from the opposite sex. We all love that one, don't we? And what has been found when looking at high-performing teams and high-performing leaders was actually there was little difference between men and women when it came to emotional intelligence. So really what we're saying is actually people adapt and develop those skills in emotional intelligence, and they become more effective, essentially. So we pick up the strengths that we need in areas they lack of. So rather than it being, well, women are this, men are this, I really firmly believe that actually it's different traits that may be seen as feminine or seen as masculine, and we kind of pick them up depending on what that is. So if we look at all of this, I think one of the key things when it comes to empathy is vulnerability, and how that has been seen as really negative. So it's that reframe again of looking at emotions, right? And actually vulnerability has had a kind of a reframe, thankfully, because I I see it as a superpower, being able to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's brilliant for like building communication within teams and really effective kind of inclusive leadership. And so it's now seen as a super positive thing and the signs of a great leader. So if we take something that's happened really recently and look at an example from within the financial services industry, there was someone who works at HSBC, Jonathan Frostwick, who unfortunately suffered a heart attack earlier this month. But then that actually prompted him to reflect and look on the negative working patterns actually that had got him to that point. And what he did was he shared that on LinkedIn. Now that share has gone viral. As of this morning, there were nearly 300,000 kind of interactions and likes on the post and over 15,000 comments. And these comments are well wishes of obviously getting well, but also lots of people sharing really similar stories. And what that shows us is the power of storytelling, the power that it brings us together. So when we're able to be more vulnerable, we're able to display that empathy, which is what we're seeing in the comments, then actually that kind of has this lovely kind of bringing us together. So this emotion is actually such a superpower. You know, we were able to celebrate his ability to be vulnerable, to show a side that we don't normally see within the financial services industry, or that's usually seen as acceptable. Yeah. And it's really obviously powerful to see that emotion. I think that's, and also that infallibility. Yeah. And that's why it's touched so many people. So when we're able to be more emotional, we're able to kind of bring our whole person to work, and we're able to create more kind of community, be better leaders. It's just trickle, it's a ripple effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we all understand that of each other as well, I think that's important. Yeah. I mean, you raised a couple of really interesting points here. One of the things you talked about is social conditioning. And I'm going to put my hand up as a mother of two boys. I'm absolutely sure I told them when they were little to, you know, stop crying and be a big boy. Yeah, because little boys don't cry and you've got to be brave. And there is a bit of social, when you sit back and think about it, it does start sometimes from an early age, doesn't it? It's, you know, we use the phrase man up, don't we? It's, you know, when you think about it. And I think your example there about the power of demonstrating vulnerability, you know, it's you know, a phrase that we've all heard a lot in the last year is it's okay to say that you're not okay. Yeah, and we've got to really believe that's actually true, and that as an industry we embrace that, and we can see the benefits of demonstrating vulnerability. Yeah. Bukola, what about you? You mentioned earlier about, or I think I did in the introduction, about you having brothers. So you've certainly got experiences of men and emotions. Do you want to talk us through some of that?
Absolutely. So growing up with brothers and just having anyone that's had close male members in their life, you kind of see how nature and nurture plays and how they grow up. And you see how phrases like boys don't cry and just those kind of phrases kind of teaches them to push down their emotions and not to be as expressive as women. So I think that is where, I guess, when we're all born, men and women take a deviating path, is how we are reared and how we were taught to handle emotions. And like I said, I grew up with two brothers, so I've seen how they handle their emotions, and it has to do with suppressing it until a point to which it builds up. And then you get stories of people getting heart attacks and just health issues. And it just goes to show that emotions are something that do demand to be felt and dealt with, that suppressing it will not do anyone any favor. It will just end up becoming a bomb that will eventually explode. And the explosion can be detrimental to yourself and also the people within your vicinity as well. And just to chime in on what Uppy said about storytelling, I think it is incredibly powerful what the post was. And I think storytelling is important in giving people permission to come into work as their full self. I think especially when you're starting in an industry, you're very nervous about how you might be perceived if you do come in with emotions. But if your leaders, if your managers are already doing it, you feel more welcome to do so as well. And I think, again, this shows the importance of storytelling and just leaders taking their position as leaders and just being honest about who they are as well, which is human beings.
Absolutely, you know, some great points here, and I think you made some really interesting ones about how this can relate to mental health. but also about leaders, and how they need to work with people in their environment that do demonstrate emotion, and how we can help each other. Upi, it looks like you might want to add a little bit to that.
Yeah,
Do you? Yeah.
I just want to say that it's also really important to note that, you know, when we have the example that I shared with the HSBC manager, that had such an impact, and, you know, people are talking about it, but let's flip that around. Would that be the same if that was a woman who had shared that? Would that have received as much attention? And I think it's that social conditioning and that stereotypes of this is what we think men are, this is what we think women are. So actually that probably has happened, and we probably have numerous instances where women have said, I you know, there's a lot of pressure on me, and actually they haven't received as much of that. This is why we create kind of cultures of inclusion and allyship, because when men speak, we listen. So hopefully that helps, that you know, the impact of this storytelling and this sharing, this vulnerability now is actually going to be seen. Actually, this is what's been happening for a really long time, but we need to start listening.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I just love that analogy that you talk about. We spoke about it before, didn't we, when we were doing some pre-work for this call, when you talked about flipping.
It's something that I learned actually when I was doing my executive program, and there's this really interesting way that you can, it's called Flip It to Test It. It was created by the HR director of Roche Diagnostics, and essentially flip any situation and see how that feels. So an example that I always use is in the workplace, if a male in the workplace is about to have their first child, very rarely is there a conversation with that person's manager saying, oh, well, I assume you'll probably want to go to part-time now because you're having a first child, or you're going to miss out on this promotion, unfortunately, because you won't be in the office as much. But that the research tells us that actually that's the conversations that women have had and have constantly and still have. So really, actually, let's flip that situation around. And if it sounds ridiculous, we need to question. But that's a tool that I use a lot. And I think it's really important when it's, especially gender, it's really easy to look at that from that perspective.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I actually think we're seeing, you know, some of the examples you gave there, I do think we're massively progressing as an industry in terms of things like parental leave and, you know, shared responsibility. But it's just a great little technique, I think, that, you know, that we can use. So I really loved it when you spoke to me about that last time. So let's think about emotions at work. You know, is it acceptable to have a bit of a weak moment, you know? And I know at times in my past, I'm quite happy to admit, I'm somebody that maybe cries at times too easily, you know, bite the tongue and, you know, say, be brave. And sometimes physically we all react differently, don't we? Some people fight, you know, it's almost they're trying to prevent the emotion, as we talked about, almost, I don't want to leak this out, but it's really hard. How can we channel it appropriately? You know, how do we deal with it? Upi, what's your thoughts on this one?
So I'll share a story as well. So I don't think I've cried at work for a really long time. I think there is times when I've cried at work because I felt it was really unfair. And that's the biggest thing, that it's the unfair. And it was a male boss. And I can distinctly remember that. We won't go into that now. But actually, I cried last year because I was working on something that I thought I was told by everybody it was happening. And then it was a big thing. It'll happen one day. But, and I literally got off the phone, was completely professional, put the phone down, and I burst into tears. And I run my consultancy. It's, you know, so my kids and my husband came back from school at that point and were like, what's going on? And I don't think I've ever done that, but actually I'm really glad I did, because that told me that meant something to me. Yeah, you know, and that told me that was important, but it was the release that I needed because it was building up. So that's really important. And I wholeheartedly think that it's imperative that we show emotions at work. I do that when I work with, you know, I work with lots of different people, lots of different clients, and I will show the emotion that I need to show, that it, you know, in a measured way. And I think we need to do that to bring our whole selves to work. I think that's the key, and the emotion is all part of that. And if we're holding that back, we're policing our behavior, it will have an impact, you know, it will lead to resentment, over analyzing maybe in the moment, and potentially more serious, long lasting mental health issues. And we all have mental health. I think we really need to kind of understand that, you know, it's just like our physical health, and we are on a spectrum, and some days might be better than others, just like how we have our physical health. So when we talk about stereotypes, which I think what we were talking about before, and then, you know, this well-troped stereotype of women cry more at work than men, and it comes back to those gender stereotypes and that social conditioning. And, you know, what we see in the world, how we see the world is directly related to what we've seen in the world. So, you know, what we've been told, what we've been heard, what we've seen around us, all of that bias forms what we think is acceptable or not in that situation. So crime doesn't fit in with our image of, you know, stereotypical manhood, essentially. And culturally, in some regions, you know, this has been evidence across the world, and depending on the cultural norms of that particular space, it's either deemed as acceptable or not for, you know, either gender to display that emotion. There's also lots of scientific reasons why women may cry more at work or outwardly show more emotion. There has been some studies done on emotional tears, which found that women cry 30 to about 60 times a year, whereas men cry 6 to 17 times per year. And actually this was based on data that actually where the men were self-reporting that. So there might be actually higher level, self-reporting is lower. And in the 60s, they found that female tear ducts actually are more shallow. So from a kind of a physical perspective, where it's easier for women to produce tears, and men's tear ducts are larger and less likely for the tears to spill out onto your cheek, etc. And hormones play a part. We need to think about, you know, our hormones, and there's a hormone called prolactin, and actually it's found higher levels of women, and actually that's found in high levels of tears, emotional tears. Yeah.
So now I know why I cry more, but I'm a much better at it. Bukola, what about you? You've got some great thoughts on this one as well, haven't you, about emotions at work?
Yeah, I'm on the same side as Uppy. I do believe that we need to start or continue to normalize emotions at work. What I think people view as weakness, meaning showing emotion, I think is actually a great show of strength. It takes strength to be vulnerable. It takes strength to go to someone and say, I need help, or I'm going through a difficult time, because what we've been conditioned to do is to kind of hold that in. So to go in an opposite direction to what is normal for you takes a lot of strength and a lot of vulnerability. So I think that we can channel our emotions at work through empathy with each other. I think the golden rule, which we're all taught from the moment we were young, you teach kids, at nurseries, kindergarten, which is treat others how you want to be treated. I think as we grow up, we kind of lose that sentiment amongst between each other, and we start to view people as, oh, you're an employee, you're an employer, this is the position you're in. And I think if we introduce back empathy into the workplace, how we interact with each other, and also just how we progress in the workplace will be completely different.
Brilliant. We started to stray earlier in the conversation there from emotions into hormones. Great, a great segue in there. So Upi, do you want to talk to us a little bit about other areas of being female and how we're different?
So I'm going to do this really quickly because we've only got a couple of minutes. And so if anyone wants to follow up with me, let me know, and I will send them some more information and some references to some books. But I think when we think of women in the workplace, we consider so much, but we usually ever talk about actually our biochemistry, our monthly cycles, and the impacts that can have on women on a daily basis. So we as women can utilize our own unique biochemistry to essentially biohack ourselves to the top. And it's coming back to that data, knowing about ourselves. So there's a fabulous book by someone called Alyssa Vitti called Woman Code. I implore you to read that. I'm going to go over it very quickly, but that's basically what you should look at. But essentially one of the best parts in the quotes that she says, and she kind of encapsulates it in this sentence, is women are seeking to shift imbalances created by the patriarchy. We must stop modeling our lives on a masculine biochemical 24-hour schedule. It's time to work based on female paradigm of productivity, success, and fulfillment. So essentially there are all these natural, predictable function, like hormone fluctuations within each woman's kind of biochemistry that affect our mood and our energy and our cognition. And so understanding each phase of your cycle will provide you with amazing kind of brain superpowers. So we know exactly when we can plan and optimize that biochemistry to excel us in the workplace. There's 4 different phases. The first phase is the creative superstar. So that's a time to like really you have access to the most creative energy. Then it's the next phase, which is the ovulatory phase, which is where you can communicate really well. And actually that's a time to book in those big meetings because you're a magnet to people. Then is your luteal phase, which is actually the longest, and that's your power phase. That's the time to get all your big tasks done and lots of admin and everything like that. And that's the longest phase of our cycles. And then it's the menstruation phase. And obviously that's going to be quite taxing on your emotions. But essentially what we do there is that's a time for reflection and, you know, having that existential crisis on solving the world's biggest problems, essentially.
Thank you for sharing that. I just love that, actually. Certainly for those of you who are still in that stage. I'm going to have a whole other podcast, I think, on postmenopausal, where I'm sure the hormones are very different, at least so I'm told. But I think that's just like fascinating. So we'll all be plotting it out, working out what is the best day to have these difficult conversations, or yeah. So
that big meeting, you know,
put the big meeting in,
whatever it may be.
Yeah, get the job interview on the day that you want, that suits your hormones, right? Exactly. Or ask for a pay rise on the day that suits you best. Exactly. There you go. Just loads of great stuff here, but also for those women listening in, it's all about making sure that you understand that our industry is absolutely inclusive in a whole lot of different ways, yeah? And being emotional is fine, it's okay. So with just a couple of minutes to go, I'm just going to ask you both, before we close off, what's your key message or your tip or to the people that are listening into this podcast? Upi, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think our emotions empower us. I think we need to understand our own personal data. We should be mapping it, you know, getting as much of this is information that we're providing to everyone and everywhere. Why are we not tracking it ourselves? And, you know, our emotions are a force for good. So don't be scared about how you come across in the workplace. Healthy, positive workplaces that are psychologically safe, that create these avenues to have, you know, real conversations, that have high levels of empathy, of vulnerability and trust, will allow us to be more emotionally intelligent.
Yeah, fantastic. Some just great stuff in there. So fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Bukola, what about your thoughts to end with?
What I would end with is just the importance of communication. I think communication is incredibly key, and also learning the art of communication as well. We talk at each other a lot, but we rarely talk with each other. And just to like echo what Upi said, that communication builds trust. And with trust, you have a safe environment where everyone can flourish. So I would advise everyone from juniors to leaders to managers to really, really hone in on the art of communication.
I just love your example there about communicating with and not at, and I think that's a really great message to send out, isn't it? So with that, all of that in mind, I think we just had such an amazing session today, and I'd really like to thank you both for just taking time out, for spending some time with me, talking about all these really interesting topics. Hopefully we'll all be away reading about EQ, emotions, IQ, how does it all fit together? But actually, I think the key message is don't be afraid of your emotions, yeah? Use them as a force for good, yeah? So, you know, make the best of ourselves. And I think hopefully it's all about ensuring that within our industry, we also have a culture of well-being and demonstrate that we really are inclusive organisations. And if you're listening and think that you're too emotional for our industry, well, think again. Hopefully we've demonstrated today that that's certainly not the case. So thanks again to our two guests. I've so enjoyed speaking to you both. And thanks for everybody else for listening in. It's always great fun to have these monthly sessions. And enjoy your holiday weekend. And then do join us again on the 28th of May for the next one in this series, where our topic, really interesting, will be about driving change. So have a lovely weekend, everybody, and we'll speak real soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.